President Trump says his NATO summit was a, quote, great success after NATO allies were convinced to spend billions more on defense. CBS News Chief White House Correspondent Major Garrett has the latest.
I believe in NATO. I think NATO is a very important.
After leading allies to believe the U.S. might abandon its commitment to NATO, President Trump reversed course at an impromptu press conference, but he reiterated his demand that U.S. allies spend more on defense.
Prior to last year, where I attended my first meeting, it was going down. The amount of money being spent by countries was going down and down very substantially.
That is false. Allied NATO defense spending has increased on average 3.1% since 2014. NATO nations have accelerated future spending pledges under Mr. Trump's persistent pressure, with a goal of reaching 2% of GDP by 2024. 5 of 29 NATO nations currently hit that mark.
We will go to much higher than 2% into the future.
Though French President Emmanuel Macron said there was no deal to raise spending above that threshold now or in the future. The president was also asked if NATO allies had expressed concern about his upcoming meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
But they actually thanked me for meeting with President Putin. I look forward to the meeting. They thanked me. They thought it was a great thing that I was doing it.
And he described Putin as his, quote, competitor.
He's been very nice to me the times I've met him. I've been nice to him. He's a competitor. You know, somebody was saying, is he an enemy? He's not my enemy.
Mr. Trump said he would raise the issue of Russian meddling in the U.S. election.
He may deny it. I mean, it's one of those things. So all I can do is say, did you, and don't do it again. But he may deny it.
Major Garrett joins me now from Brussels. So, Major, as you mentioned in your piece, defense spending from NATO allies has actually increased since 2014. So why is the president pushing for more military spending from NATO members now?
Because he wants the alliance, he says, to be stronger and a more believable military alliance. The president sort of confuses a lot of different numbers. He said today that the United States is responsible for 90% of NATO spending, or 70%. It's nowhere near those percentages. It's closer to about 60% when you think about how this actually is constructed. There isn't a NATO defense budget. There's not any account here in Brussels, where the NATO headquarters are located, that assembles all of the defense spending for the 29 member nations. What the 29 member nations do, sovereign nations by themselves within an alliance, is pledge to spend a certain amount of money on their own defense. That's how this works. What the president wants is the 29 nations in NATO to reach that 2% threshold as rapidly as possible. The current schedule calls for all nations to reach that by 2024. And that's what was agreed to here. The president said yesterday it had to be done immediately. Then just hours later he said, oh, it's been a great success and it's going to take several years. So the practical truth is, in 2014, NATO agreed to accelerate defense spending. Why did it do that? Because for years, NATO member nations, not named the United States, were decreasing the amount of money they were allocating toward defense. And after Russia invaded Crimea, then took possession of it, NATO member nations said, you know what, Russia could be a real threat, and we better buttress our own mutual defense by spending more on equipment and personnel. That process, again, began in 2014. It is continuing. The president wants to accelerate. And there is, to give him some credit, ample evidence that in this last year there's been more focus, more debate, and a more rapid willingness to pledge future increases in defense spending in reaction to the president's rhetoric. But the process was well underway before he was inaugurated.
So then, Major, the question is, from the president's perspective, did he achieve the goals he set before leaving for the NATO summit?
Well, I don't know if he achieved his goals, because if you were to listen to him on the first day he was here in Brussels, his goals were to get NATO to do something about this gas pipeline deal between Germany and Russia. NATO's not going to do anything about that. That's proceeding. Then he also said he wanted this immediate pledge to rapidly hit that 2% threshold. Nothing changed on that score either. So the things he complained about his first day here in Brussels did not change. Even so, today, his second day in Brussels, he declared total victory and said NATO is now a fine-tuned machine and in much better shape and much stronger than it was 2 days ago. I guarantee you, Elaine, all the other NATO ministers who are here will tell you what the French president, Emmanuel Macron, said right after the president's press conference. NATO's still the same. The pledges are still the same. The process is still the same. The president's rhetoric, though, changed noticeably one day to the next.
Well, President Trump is currently in the UK for a meeting with Prime Minister Theresa May. Is he approaching conversations with her differently than ones with other NATO allies?
Well, not necessarily differently, but they have a better understanding, and UK is on the other side, the positive side of that 2% threshold. 5 NATO nations are: the United States, the United Kingdom, and 3 other much smaller nations with much smaller economies and smaller defense budgets. They're going to talk about not only the military part of NATO, but what Prime Minister May's approach to Brexit will be, what her approach to immigration will be, and some other things like the Iran nuclear deal. The British government does not agree with President Trump's withdrawal from that, and some issues that have come up about politics. Remember, a while back, the president was severely criticized in Britain for retweeting a very far-right political group in Britain. The Prime Minister took note of that. Many British politicians took unfavorable note of that. And that's one of the reasons there are these massive protests in the streets of London, protests that are conspicuous enough that most of the president's travel while in the United Kingdom will be conducted by helicopter, so he can see them from above as opposed to face, as he might if he were in a motorcade.
Well, President Trump is scheduled to meet with Vladimir Putin next week. What are both sides looking to achieve from this meeting, and what are NATO allies specifically watching for?
Well, the president offered a few ideas about what he might discuss with Vladimir Putin. Didn't offer any commitments, didn't say that he had a particular agenda. Said he would raise the issue of election meddling in 2016, but it didn't sound as if he was going to drive that very hard in terms of the conversations with Vladimir Putin. There are some issues that the Europeans are going to watch very carefully. Ukraine. Will the president do or say anything or give the impression that the Kremlin could later interpret as acknowledging or accepting Russia's annexation of Crimea? The Europeans will also watch very closely to see if the president says anything about military exercises conducted by NATO in the Baltic states, because the Russians would like those to end. NATO thinks they're important as a part of projecting strength toward Russia. So the Europeans are a bit fearful that the president does not have a defined agenda for this first big-time face-to-face and lengthy encounter with Putin. They're afraid that in the absence of a strong American agenda, a sort of a to-do list with Moscow, Moscow's to-do list will dominate the conversation and might, they fear, lead to some uncomfortable concessions by President Trump.
Finally, Major, earlier Thursday, President Trump tweeted out a picture of a letter that he said was sent to him by Kim Jong-un. Now, the letter refers to Mr. Trump as Your Excellency several times and says North Korea looks forward to a, quote, better future between the U.S. and North Korea. What else can you tell us about the letter?
Well, the letter doesn't say anything about Topic A, Elaine. And what is Topic A? Denuclearization. It was the whole point of the summit in Singapore, to establish the means by which not only North Korea would commit to denuclearization and then create an atmosphere where the United States and North Korea could work out, negotiate specific steps to achieve it. The letter says nothing about that. It talks about practical actions both nations could take to convening yet another meeting, but nothing on the substance of what was supposed to have been achieved at that Singapore summit. And 2 things have happened since that summit. 1, the North Koreans have stymied all U.S. efforts to engage on a timetable for inspections of their nuclear sites, which are the necessary first step to achieve denuclearization. And the North Koreans didn't even show up for a scheduled meeting with the Americans about repatriating American war dead from the Korean War. Remember, President Trump touted that as one of the big successes of the Singapore summit. Now, that meeting is supposed to occur in the coming days, but the fact remains, the North Koreans stood up the American delegation, insulting them over an issue the president identified as one of his top priorities after the Singapore summit. So, a nice letter, no substance, and hard to see very much in that letter that appreciably changes the relationship between the United States and North Korea.
All right, Major Garrett for us. Major, thank you.
Sure.